Hey everyone, can you hear us? Perfect. So, muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Alexandra, formo parte del Migration Youth and Children
Hello,
Platform.
everybody. My name is Alexandra, and I am part of the Migration Youth and Children Platform. We're looking to move forward in eradicating the forceful detention of children in Europe. Detention has been well documented, and it never has good results. International organisms, including the Committee of Children's Rights, are adamant about this fact. The freedom of children is a right, and depriving them of this freedom is completely unacceptable. It has psychological effects, and this should not happen to children. However, 27 European children are still detaining, European countries are still detaining children. So we need to look for solutions to these challenges and to be open to models of community fostering. So our first intervention will be from Cepaim. So I will introduce you to the first speaker from Cepaim, a Spanish organization, Valeria Méndez.
La inclusión de las personas migrantes y la defensa de sus derechos. Valeria Méndez de Vigo, abogada, máster en políticas y gestión de las migraciones y el asilo.
Valeria Méndez de Vigo has provided several postgraduate courses on leadership and management on trauma. She's been working for over 25 years in community development, and she currently works in the Advocacy department of the Cepaim organization. Valeria, you have the floor. Thank you, Alexandra. Good afternoon, everybody. For me, it is an honor to participate today in this panel titled Working to End the Detention of Migrant Children in Europe, as part of this World Congress on the Future with Children. To talk about alternatives to the detention of migrant minors is to talk about childhood rights and the democratic quality of our institutions. At CONVIVE Fundación Cepaim, as Alexandra has mentioned, we work for an intercultural and cohesive society that facilitates full access to rights for migrants, particularly children and teenagers. My presentation will be short. It's called Beyond the Laws, Reality and Alternatives to the Detention of Migrant Children. And it is divided into 4 very brief sections on the context in Spain. I want to highlight 4 points. First, a review of the legal prohibition of the detention of minors in Spain. Second, the existence of de facto detentions. Third, alternatives and programs that are currently in place. And fourth, I would like to highlight the new European Pact on Migration and Asylum and its implications on migrant minors. So I would like to start with something essential. Does Spain not detain minors? I titled this Legal Protection Without Sufficient Guarantees. From a legal perspective, Spain expressly prohibits the detention and internment of minors on the basis of their immigration status. This is provided for in Article 62b of Organic Law 4/2000 on the rights and freedoms of foreigners, which clearly states that minors may not be admitted to a foreign internment center. This means that minors cannot be deprived of their liberty because of their immigration status. However, there are certain ways of detention that can be used. So first, there are errors in age assessment. There are minors who arrive without documentation, and they may be subjected to invasive medical tests, such as bone x-rays or dental analysis, which have very high margins of error. So these tests can declare that children are of age when they are actually minors, and they will not be treated as minors. They may therefore be admitted to a foreigner's detention center, or expelled without access to guardianship, or even referred to inappropriate resources for adults. So these is the first case, errors in age assessment. The second case is that of minors accompanying adults in the process of detention or expulsion. Here we have to take into account that in some cases, the children of detained adult migrants may be placed in a restrictive environment without an adequate assessment of specific alternatives. The third case is detention at the border or in other areas. In Ceuta and Melilla and other international airports, initial reception conditions do not always guarantee the rights of minors. Children and adolescents may be held for days or weeks without freedom of movement, without contact with specialized personnel, and without clear legal guarantees. Third, the situation in the Canary Islands deserves being highlighted. The Canary Islands are one of the regions under the most pressure in terms of receiving unaccompanied migrant minors. And it should be noted that in 2024, the Canary Islands recorded the arrival of 46,843 migrants by sea, the highest figure in the history of the archipelago. Currently, the Canary Islands government has more than 5,800 unaccompanied minors under its care. Numerous organizations have highlighted the overcrowding and saturation of reception centers and have stressed the need to provide the island with adequate infrastructure and specialized personnel for the identification, reception, and integration of minors. So what alternatives do we have? At CONVIVE, we have been developing real and humane alternatives to the detention of migrant minors for years. So here are just a few. We have mentoring programs, which connect young people with adult role models and offer educational, emotional, and legal support. We have independent living apartments, or living flats, such as the 17+ program, which supports their transition to adulthood. We have family or community foster care, such as Hogar Malala Project, which creates safe environment, especially for single-parent families. And the socio-educational intervention with an intercultural and gender-based approach. These alternatives are not only more humane and rights-based, they also work better. They promote integration, well-being, and the personal development for boys and girls.
Una mención breve al Pacto Europeo de Migración y Asilo, ¿no? Que plantea unos ciertos riesgos de retroceso.
Sandra, I would like to mention the European Pact on Asylum. We believe that all the border procedures can take place at key moments. This is one of the most controversial points of this pact because it does not prohibit the detention of minors. Even though it is supposed to be a last-minute measure, it can detain migrants, especially minors. And what can we do about it? We believe that the states, in order to cover the gaps of this pact, should explicitly prohibit the detention of minors. The political discourse tends to polarize migrant issues in Europe. Even when we're talking about children and young people, children's rights are a collective responsibility. The child migrant needs to be at the core of political policies. Their dignity in the future depends on this. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Melanie Teff es especialista en
Next,
migración y desplazamiento.
we will hear from our next speaker who is online, whose name is Melanie. Melanie has been working for several organizations for 25 years. She has been focusing on migration and refugees. She spent 9 years in the UK working on the protection of children. She currently works as a consultant for UNICEF. Melanie, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? You can hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who is organizing this. This is such an important time to be discussing this crucial issue in the lead up to the implementation of the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum in June next year, and also while negotiations are taking place on the EU's proposed return regulation. So it's so important to be discussing from the outset how alternatives to detention will function within the framework of the Pact, and to be learning from each other's experiences of implementing successful alternatives to detention. Firstly, there is indisputable evidence about the long-lasting and devastating impact of detention on a child's physical, emotional, and psychological health, well-being, and development. Numerous studies have shown that detention harms children regardless of the conditions in which they are held, and that this damage can occur even if the detention is for a relatively short duration and in supposedly child-friendly facilities. For children with their families, studies have shown clear evidence of the damage that detention causes to parents' ability to effectively parent in detention settings, and the impact that this has on children. So investing in child-sensitive approaches, including child-sensitive alternatives to detention, pays in results for the children and families affected, preventing the serious damage of detention. It pays off for the communities in which these children and families will live, perhaps in the country where they're currently living. And for those children and families who will be returning, it pays off for achieving sustainable reintegration. When considering the EU's proposed return regulation, it is important to emphasize that return and reintegration cannot be seen as two separate processes. They must be seen as linked, particularly for children. And the more a host state invests in a child and ensures that the child is not damaged by migration or asylum processes, then the greater the chance of successful reintegration if the child returns. And that, of course, includes investment in reception and care arrangements that respect children's rights. UNICEF is committed to working with governments towards an end to all child immigration detention, in line with the clear position taken by international human rights mechanisms, particularly the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, that detention of children for immigration-related purposes, whether they are alone or with their families, is never in their best interests, is a violation of child rights, and should not be used even as a measure of last resort. In some countries, UNICEF has worked with governments towards prohibitions on child immigration detention, and I know that Carolina from IDC will talk about some of those, perhaps next. And Valeria, who was just speaking, correctly pointed out that the EU Pact does sadly permit detention of children in exceptional circumstances, and that is not in line with the international legal position. But it is important to emphasize that the EU Pact is clear that children, as a rule, should not be detained. The Pact requires that before detention can be applied, alternatives to detention have to have been considered, and they have to have been analysed and eventually ruled out, and written reasons provided as to why an alternative to detention is not appropriate in the individual's case. And the lack of available alternatives cannot be a reasonable ground to detain individuals. The EU Asylum Agency's guidance points out that member states must consider alternatives to detention that uphold the best interests of the child and prioritise their well-being, including by placing children in safe environments. Globally, UNICEF has worked with many governments to support their reception and care arrangements that avoid the use of detention. Within Europe, UNICEF has supported a number of initiatives that provide rights-respecting, community-based reception and care arrangements for children. And this starts with ensuring that adequate case management systems are in place for children. So that means ensuring that national child protection case management frameworks are in place, and which include all children, including asylum-seeking and migrant children. Globally, UNICEF has focused a lot of attention on strengthening the capacity of social services workforces, which is critical in preventing the immigration detention of children and families through effective case management, including prompt identification, screening, registration, assessment, and referral to appropriate services. The social services workforce can also assess the needs of vulnerable migrant families to prevent family separation, except in those rare cases where separation is necessary to safeguard a child's best interests. For unaccompanied and separated children, case management will include an assessment to determine the child's immediate needs, appointing a guardian to safeguard the child's best interests, and a multidisciplinary determination of the best interests of the child. The individual assessment and best interest determination informs referral, care and protection procedures, family tracing where that is appropriate, and the eventual identification of a sustainable solution in a timely manner. The role of guardians in supporting unaccompanied and separated children to live in the community has been demonstrated to be key in helping them to understand the various systems in a new country, facilitating their access to services and helping them to engage with their asylum and migration processes. For example, in Italy, UNICEF has worked to support the government in strengthening the guardianship system. In a poll conducted with children receiving these guardianship services in Italy, over 80% of children who had a guardian said that they feel they're being heard. And over 50% said that they look on the guardian as friends or a familiar figure on whom they can rely. UNICEF has welcomed the provisions in the EU Pact that promote the standardisation of rules on guardianship across the EU. Establishing minimum reception and care standards and independent monitoring of their implementation is essential for child protection. In Germany, there were concerns that conditions in reception centres could pose significant protection risks to children in the absence of nationwide policies and standards to safeguard children and their families in these centres. So UNICEF worked with the German Ministry for Family Affairs, together with over 30 partners, to launch an initiative which produced minimum standards for the protection of refugees and migrants living in refugee centres, as well as training materials and tools for service providers. The initiative focuses in particular on vulnerable groups, including children. To put the standards into practice, the German Ministry of Family Affairs funded 100 protection coordinators in refugee centres taking part in the initiative nationwide. As well as technical support and trainings on the standards, there has been ongoing monitoring, including sessions involving children who could provide their own feedback on their first-hand experiences of living in the accommodation centres. For unaccompanied children, where possible, UNICEF supports foster and family-based care that allows children without parental care to live in a family setting within a community, including kinship care, and the strengthening of systems to ensure that placements have been selected, qualified, approved and supervised for providing such care, in conformity with the UN guidelines for the alternative care of children. For example, in the Netherlands, NIDOS, the organisation responsible for guardianship, places children under the age of 15 in foster care, as well as those over the age of 15 who have specific needs. A comprehensive matching process is undertaken to identify the family that can best meet the child's needs. Social workers are responsible for the recruitment of foster families, for matching and monitoring and supporting the foster placement. And NIDOS also has temporary foster carers who live close to the asylum application centre and are able to provide temporary care for children while they await longer-term foster placement. Many states are looking for ways to expand the options for alternative care, particularly for adolescents who will fairly soon turn 18 and age out of alternative care arrangements, and to provide appropriate support in preparing for their transition to independent living. In Greece, in partnership with the NGO Metadrasi, UNICEF and UNHCR piloted the supported independent living model, where older children are supported in small group homes. Social workers and support services were available, but not with 24-hour supervision, with the aim of preparing older children for independent adulthood. In this model, each child is supported by a multidisciplinary team, including, for example, a social worker, a carer, a legal representative, to give them individual support, facilitate their access to a range of services, and work with them to build independent living skills. For children, engagement-based models of alternatives to detention that use case management focused on case resolution are the most effective. It's also crucial to consider the impacts on children that enforcement-based ATD models can have. For example, the impacts on children's mental health and feelings of stigma if their parent is subject to electronic surveillance. By building trust in the system, providing stability, and facilitating agency, case management is an efficient and cost-effective approach to governing migration without causing the damage that immigration detention inevitably causes. With a reminder of the importance of this next few months in Europe on this issue, with EU member states making plans at the moment for how they will implement the EU Pact in their national context, and with a lot of discretion for EU member states to decide on how they will do so in their own national context. Thank you very much.
Bien, muchas gracias, Mel. Seguimos con la intervención de Carolina
Thank you very
Gottardo,
much,
la directora ejecutiva de
Mel.
Advocacy.
We're going to give the floor to Carolina Gottardo. Carolina is a Colombian migrant who has been working on human rights, and she has been involved in these different contexts. Currently, she is the executive director of IDC, where she started in 2020. She used to be part of the Latin American Women's Rights Service in London. Carolina serves on a number of boards, including the Migrant Women's Network and the Asia Pacific Refugee Network. She has worked extensively in policy, advocacy, and government relations. I now give the floor to Carolina.
Good afternoon. For me, it's a pleasure to be a part of this event. And as Alexandra, Valeria, and Melanie were saying, it's a great opportunity to highlight an issue that is very important in Europe, and it needs urgent action. So I will now speak in English.
What I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk a little bit about what is IDC and the European Alternatives to Detention Network, and then talk about what alternatives to detention is and the benefits of alternatives to detention, and then about the child-sensitive community assessment and placement model, some examples of promising practice, and the issue of technology that Melanie started referring to begin with. So, I mean, for those of you that don't know, IDC, we're a global network, and we have members in 75 countries. And we're working specifically on this issue of reducing and ultimately ending immigration detention, and promoting alternatives to detention. So we're working across the world, in Africa, Asia, the Americas, in the MENA region, and in Europe, on this specific issue of alternatives to detention, and we tend to have what we call a very specific solution-based approach. So it's about building bridges and relations in terms of changing the narrative and having some impact on what is a politicized area, which is immigration detention, and promoting alternatives to detention. So as such, we have a lot of we do have a lot of connections with different governments, and we work very closely with our members in civil society and with the UN. And we co-lead the UN Migration Network work stream on alternatives with UNICEF and ACNUR and UNHCR. at the global level. In Europe, we have been working for quite a while, and we coordinate the so-called European Alternatives to Detention Network. And this is a group of European NGOs, and Cepaim is one of these NGOs that seeks to reduce and end immigration detention, building evidence and momentum on the effectiveness of alternatives to detention. So this is across Belgium, Bulgaria, Poland, Cyprus, Spain, the UK, Portugal, and Italy. So these are different NGOs that are running projects or pilot projects on alternatives to detention, and as such implement quality case management on alternatives to detention and build evidence and act as a learning hub on alternatives, and foster collaborations also with governments and civil society partnerships and different actors, and engage in tactical advocacy. So there is quite a lot of evidence coming from that, and the evidence is showing very clearly that alternatives to detention work. And this is important, and I'm going to be speaking about why and how. So what is alternatives to detention? And this is not a topic that everyone understands. So the definition is any law or policy or practice by which persons are not detained for reasons that are related to their immigration status. And for those who are online, you could see hopefully the PowerPoint there with the different graphs and definitions, etc., that my colleague Luisa is projecting. So through research, we have identified examples across the world, more than 200 of alternatives to detention that are implemented either by governments or by civil society, the UN, or others. And here what we need to understand is it shifts the emphasis away from securitization and from criminalization to approaches that are focused on case resolution. And therefore, it could be a win-win for migrants and for governments, and this is what we need to focus on. Because detention, and Melanie said this before, I mean, the effects on immigration detention are devastating, and this is a word that shows how it impacts individuals, but also their families and entire communities of those affected by it. But the issue that things do not have to be this way. And this is the main message, because there are these alternatives. So there are 3 benefits to alternatives to detention. Again, shown by evidence. So it's well-being, it's the fact that they are effective, and it's the fact that they're also cost-effective or much cheaper. So we will go to look at this. So well-being, we're thinking about, and this is kind of obvious. People are going to be better off, and there is a lot of evidence showing that people are going to be better off in the community. I'm talking about children and their families, and people affected by detention in general, away from any sort of restriction of the freedom of movement in the community. This is better for their health, for their well-being, etc. So we're talking about human rights, we're talking about health and well-being. Then, but alternatives are also effective in the sense that they lead towards case resolution. And case resolution is what we need to be focusing on. And this does not affect compliance. So they could also be a solution for governments. And then the third argument is that alternatives to detention are just a fraction of the cost of immigration detention. So as I was saying before, there is quite a lot of evidence coming from different parts of the world, but from Europe, showing this. So there are 3 independent evaluations in Europe with different statistics that we can look at, showing how alternatives are working in Europe. So the first one is a 2020 evaluation of case management-based alternatives in Poland, Cyprus, and Bulgaria. And the numbers here are very clear. It shows 99% improvability to participate in informed decision-making, which obviously facilitates case resolution when there is communication between the migrant and the authorities, and when people understand what's happening and what are the options. 81% improve psychological well-being, 86% people remaining engaging with immigration processes, which is a very high statistic, showing the effectiveness of alternatives, and 12% disengaging or abscond. There were 2 evaluations of pilot projects in the UK between the Home Office and different NGOs, and both of them showed very similar results. Increased stability, health, and well-being, and no decrease in compliance with immigration systems. So the same again and again, and a fraction of the cost. Then looking at this cost-effective side, it just cannot be compared. The cost of detention is huge. It's the infrastructure associated with it, it's running the centers, but it's also the cost associated with strategic litigation, capital expenditure, etc. So alternatives are on average globally, and we have done research on this, 80% cheaper or cost savings with regards compared with detention. For instance, 93% was a cost saving in Canada and 69% in Australia as examples, but this really applies around the world. So just talking about children and specifically on children, which is our topic today, I think it has been very clear from the previous speakers. Child detention is non-negotiable. It's simply a no-no. Children should not be put in detention because of their immigration status, and this is contrary to international law, and it's against the best interest of the child. Maintaining family unit also should never come or should not be the excuse to depriving children of their liberty, because that's not in their best interest. And as both Valeria and Melanie say, in Europe, we're facing some type of regression right now because of the European Pact and because of the proposed return regulation. And I think here, I'm not going to repeat what has been said. It's just what I'm going to say is the message. The message is that the key is the implementation at the national level. Governments in different European countries need to ensure that children are not detained, need to legislate against child immigration detention, need to put alternatives in place. And this is the only way that we're going to be in agreement with international law and not going to fall into a regression, because the way it's looking, detention will be expanded across Europe. And it's very important that this message against child detention continues to be very strong, and that this non-negotiable issue about non-child detention is there. So states have a discretion, they need to exercise it. They could go in a different way, they should choose not to detain children. With regards to what I was speaking, one of the models that IDC has created is the child-sensitive community assessment and placement model. And this is a positive model for child protection away from detention. So we have identified kind of key mechanisms to protect the rights of migrant children while the cases are being resolved. And you could see there in the graph, online, that we're looking at kind of 5 different elements. The first one is prevention. So it's a presumption of liberty. Children need to be out, they need to be in liberty, and this principle should be embedded in law, in policy, and applied on practice to ensure the protection from the outset. Then it's about the importance of the screening, assessment, and referral, and the authorities assessing the child, initially assessing the best interest of the child upon contact, verifying age, appointing a guardian for those that are separated, caseworker to families, intake assessment, suitable community setting, etc. Then it's about the placement and the case management per se. So this is about the proper full best interest determination, and assessing the protection needs for the child and for the family. And then the reviewing and safeguarding, which need to be all an ongoing process. And this also should be looking at legal status and independently reviewed to ensure the best interest being upheld. What are we aiming for? Case resolution. And we will say it again and again, because this is the final stage. And here we need to link this with obviously safe and regular pathways, and looking at ways where children could be protected without their freedom of movement being curtailed, or other forms that could include also voluntary return. But in reality, we're thinking about pathways here. So we're thinking about case resolution. Of course, this is not a rigid template, and this could be adapted depending on the model for different countries and the model that has been applied by NGOs, etc. I'm going to move to promising practices, and Melanie already mentioned many of them with regards to some of the models in different countries in Europe. I also want to look at other parts of the world, and also I want to look at legislation. So here a very interesting example is Belgium, because at the same time that the Asylum and Migration Pact was passed, last year Belgium outlawed child immigration detention. And this goes to show that member states can do something different. And this was kind of happening at the same time. Germany also pledged in the International Migration Review Forum to legislate on this issue. So we're hoping that that's going to be acted, which is important. We have countries like Colombia that adopt a non-detention model, and Malawi that prohibits child detention in its different forms. And other countries in Europe that do not detain children include Ireland. But also, I think Valeria mentioned before, there are progress in Spain. There is interesting practices with local authorities, and some that come to my mind are Catalonia and Aragon. And these models where children, because the problem is that when children turn 18, everything changes. But in Spain, some of the local authorities are going beyond, and that 18 doesn't become like the deadline. And it's about the issue of protection that could be extended. In Thailand, there was a memorandum of understanding between different government departments, and as a result, 2,000 children have been released from immigration detention. So again, a very good practice. And in Mexico, also legislated against child immigration detention, and now is working on the issue of the practice. I just want to finish on one topic, and it's the topic that Melanie started referring to, which was the issue of the impact of digital technology on alternatives. And many of you will be familiar that digital technologies is a constantly evolving issue that is growing, and it's growing in migration. And more technology is being used to control migration and for surveillance purposes. And this is also used in detention and in alternatives to detention. So at IDC, we have been concerned about the use of electronic tagging and monitoring as what some of the states say could be an alternative to detention. But the issue is that research has shown again and again that this is not an alternative to detention. This is an alternative form of detention, or digital detention, or de facto detention. Because the effects that this causes on people in terms of isolation, in terms of stereotyping, in terms of engagement with the community, there is a lot of research showing physical and psychological health impacts and well-being impacts. That means this is not a solution. Basically, it's an alternative form of detention, and it needs to be avoided. So at this point, IDC and the Caldor Center at the University of New South Wales were completing global research on this issue of digital technologies, detention, and alternatives to detention that we're hoping to publish very soon, but it's showing the lack of transparency on this issue, the fear and the stigmatization caused by these technologies, lack of training of people working in the borders, concerning role of the private sector, because of course the private sector benefits from all of these technologies, and the need to embed safeguards and avoid coercion. I leave it here, and I just repeating that children should never be detained for immigration, and that we need to continue moving to a new paradigm of migration governance, moving away from surveillance and from coercive approaches into expanding regular pathways into protection and into human rights. And I think this is going to be a model that is going to work much better, and I think Europe needs to be taking steps to move this way, and definitely away from immigration detention. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Y por último, escucharemos a la Migration Youth and Children Platform, que es una red liderada por jóvenes para jóvenes que promueve la participación significativa de niños, niñas y jóvenes en las políticas migratorias.
A network
Esta
that is
intervención la dará
protecting children. Aryan is going to do their presentation along with the organization which started when he was 14 years old. They have been fighting for the rights of migrants all across the world. They work with several alliances and is now the focal point on migration issues. Aryan, you have the floor.
Gracias, Alexandra. I want to start by saying one thing. The Migration Youth and Children Platform, alongside Cepaim, UNICEF, and IDC, as the platform by and for young people to impact the highest migration levels of migration policy around the world, has a clear, united, and global call: end child immigration detention. We've heard it from every single speaker on this panel today. And that message can't ring more true and more desperate than the current situation that we all face ourselves in right now. The practice is not confined to a single nation or a continent. It's an international affront to the rights and dignity of children and demands immediate action from all of us. We've heard from my fellow speakers the reality of the situation in Europe and across the world. And I want to add in one of our constituents' voices on this issue, who told me that detention might be temporary, but it has imprisoned him for life. The lived reality of immigration detention is overly overlooked, yet it's at the center of why we're here today. And we can't let that trajectory slip away from us today. And at MYCP, we're committed to changing that path. That's why, alongside UNICEF, UNHCR, and IDC, we hosted the Global Youth Consultation on Alternatives to Detention last month. From every corner of the world, the message was clear: child immigration detention causes harm. It strips children of their dignity, hinders their development, and leaves them with lasting scars on their mental health that was brought up in every single regional breakout room. We have some progress and good practices like in Mexico, Colombia, Thailand, and Belgium, but we know there are gaps in implementation, a lack of resources, and insufficient public awareness, which remain profound obstacles towards our shared mission. But we can see that community-based approaches in Uganda, for example, family reunification frameworks in West Africa, and pilot programs in Malaysia demonstrate that alternatives are not just theoretical, they are practical, humane, and effective. Young people raised how much that these little changes are supporting education, healthcare, and case management, rather than being treated like criminals for a situation that they are forced into for many of them. Young people reiterated time and time again their firm belief that migration is not a crime, it's a human right. In Europe, our GCM youth consultations declared alternatives to detention a priority for the region. European youth were clear that political commitments from leaders were necessary to ensure every child is treated with care, respect, and the welcome they deserve. Migrant youth are unaware of the legal intricacies to avoid detention or how to leave it. And so many are placed in that position because they do not have access to basic legal services or health support. Detention, in our constituents' view, is no longer a last resort, as countries promised at the adoption of the Global Compact of Migration, and that's why change is needed. Knowledge sharing is a start, but alone it's not enough. To transform this reality, we need action, and that's why MYCP has proudly produced our Youth Advocacy Toolkit, a resource specifically designed for young people 14 to 25. It aims to equip young advocates with the knowledge and strategies to challenge unjust detention practices. And most importantly, it inspires young people to lead, recognizing that their ideas are not just valuable, but vital. Young advocates around the world have shown us a way forward. In South Africa, youth-led campaigns are actively bridging gaps in child protection. In Latin America, young migrants are directly influencing policy reforms which impact their lives, and MYCP is proud to join them on this journey. These efforts should remind us all that the fight to end child immigration detention isn't just about laws and policies. It's about stories, courage, and the unyielding belief that we can create a better world. The path forward requires collective action. Governments, civil society, communities, and young people need to work together. By centralizing those at the center of this fight, we can remind people that children are not just numbers or a policy issue, they are human beings with a future that we need to protect. Each detained child carries a story of potential and the right to live free from fear. Let us harness the power of youth, the wisdom of experience, and the strength of unity to ensure that no child ever experiences the trauma of immigration detention again. And we can turn the tide. We're showing that by doing more events like these, by talking about this issue and raising it directly with the people who have the power to change their lives. And we can create a world where every young migrant is free to dream, grow, and thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aryan. So now we can proceed. If anyone has any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll ask the speakers. If not, I have some questions that was said before. So one of the questions would be, how is youth advocacy important to working to end child migration detention? And what can be done to provide support for increased youth advocacy on the issue? Which would be Aryan answering.
Sorry, Alexandra, you cut out.
So how is youth advocacy important to working to end child immigration detention, and what could be done to provide support for increased youth advocacy?
Well, youth advocacy is so important to that, and that's why MYCP is taking alternatives to detention as a priority, as voted by our constituency, to the next International Migration Review Forum next year. We're working with our young constituents and network members and organizations like IDC, Cepaim, and UNICEF to make sure that that ending child immigration detention is not just a commitment, but it's a reality, and it's made by thousands of countries around the world and people around the world. And I would say young people have a vital voice. They are those at the front line. They are the people in detention or have been in detention, and their voice has never been more important. And that's why at MyCP we're trying to centralize their voices through our global youth report on the state of migration, which will have a specific chapter on alternative detention, solidifying the youth voice on alternatives, and also our great youth consultation last month, and we hope to do many more in the months to come to make sure that young people are informed, educated, and inspired to act and create a world where they are free from fear and free from detention. So youth advocacy is super important, and it's definitely the start of a long journey. MyCP is here to do that, and we encourage everyone to join us in that fight as well.
Thank you. I just want to say, if anyone wants to speak up, you can just raise your hand and you will be given a chance to speak. Also, one of the questions would be, do you know any of the promising practices in your countries regarding the participants? So if there's no one still asking questions.
We have someone.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I just have like two different comments and questions regarding the Spanish situation, because I'm Spanish. I'm working in UNICEF Spain in the migration, and also the context of the EU. Starting with Spain, I just wanted to recall that Spain prohibits the detention of unaccompanied children, but it doesn't prohibit the detention of accompanied children. And more than that, when they regulate the detention of accompanied children, they don't recognize any right, but they recognize the right of parents to have their children with them in the detention center. So there is no child rights approach at all. And I think that we should take advantage of all the reforms that Spain will undertake to implement the EU Pact to try to correct this double protection or to accompany children and their families, because it's very easy now in Spain to have hundreds of children with their families in different closed facilities, because there is no protection, not enough protection. This one thing, and sorry, it was just this comment, and a more general one is because I've been participating in the global conference, and I was sad to hear that there is a kind of sense that we are advancing to end child deprivation of liberty all over the world, except for migrant children, no? And this was expressly said during one of the workshops by the UN Task Force representative. This is something really to spread this message has to really reach the policymakers that is extremely clear violation of rights. No, when you see the efforts at international level for the other children. And sorry for this long comment. And regarding the EU Pact, I wanted to know your opinion. If you think that there is maybe an opportunity to build more open centers to do case management, given the fact that new border procedures will push countries to create.
En cuanto al nuevo pacto, ¿qué procedimientos se implementarán para que los países puedan tomar medidas? Sabemos que se necesitan facilidades y mecanismos para que
the open way, not the closed way. Please choose the right denomination and not try to hide that you are creating the detention center. And the second question is, do you think that the independent monitoring mechanisms that are maybe, like created under the PAC can help to ensure that detention it must be a last resort measure? Thank you very much.
Who wants to answer? Mel?
I can take some.
Okay.
So thanks for that, Sarah. And I think this is a very interesting comment and also food for thought. I mean, with regards to the first part that you were saying about advancing on ending child immigration detention, I'm actually not in agreement with that statement. I think this is a regional approach. I think Europe is certainly, Europe and the US, there is a regression because of what is happening there, but I think there are many other regions around the world where we have seen promising practice and a lot of advance. I actually think there is a momentum on ending child immigration detention, but we have to look at a regional approach, and the biggest regression probably would have been these two examples that I'm mentioning. But and this kind of links with your second comment with regards to Europe. The issue, I think the pact is going in the wrong direction, right? We know that this was one of the most contentious areas of negotiation in between governments, and that not all the governments agreed with the child immigration detention. So I think the issue here is how this pact is going to be implemented, which links with what you were saying about infrastructure being created and what type of infrastructure being created. What we're seeing in some parts of the world is that there could be some co-option of language, of calling places shelters that in reality are closed centers that are detention centers. And I think we need to call a spade a spade. This is detention. This is not a shelter. This is detention. I think with regards to advocacy with the governments, and I think this advocacy really needs to focus more at the national level and at the local level, meaning with the states or with the local authorities, has to be about these points that I mentioned before. The three benefits of alternatives, because for the governments that are implementing the pact, this is such a big issue, and they actually do need solutions, and alternatives bring solutions. So these three arguments with regards to health and well-being, but with regards to effectiveness, because the governments are very worried about effectiveness, and showing that alternatives are effective. You could have people in the community, out in the community, not in these infrastructures, and then cost-effective, because looking at the type of volumes that we're thinking about, financially and from the point of view of compliance, they won't be able to cope. And even in conversations with governments, that's clear. So I think we need to see within a very bad development, which is the pact and the return regulation or the proposed return regulation, we need to see that there is an opportunity to push alternatives to detention, but we need to push them in the right way, not as alternative forms of detention, but as alternatives to detention in the community for families and with the children out. And again, on your last comment with regards to separating families, that it is not in the best interest of the child to remain in detention with their parents. It's not in the best interest of the child to have the family detained. That by itself is against international law. I mean, that's not a proper best interest determination. So this will be my comment, but I do think that we could use this. We need to frame the debate in the right way, even within a regression, because we're seeing a regression, at least at the national level in the countries in Europe.
Muchas gracias, Sara, por tus reflexiones. Totalmente de acuerdo contigo. Y efectivamente creo también, con lo que acaba de mencionar Carolina, porque el pacto, si lo vemos, se maneja constantemente en un doble lenguaje. Yo creo que ese doble lenguaje es algo que vamos a estar viendo constantemente, ¿no? Es decir, si lo ves, en realidad la realidad es que hay un punto de regresión que señalaba Carolina, clarísimo en muchos aspectos, pero al mismo tiempo el lenguaje no es de derechos humanos, no interés superior de los niños, no de los menores, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, pues efectivamente lo que hablabais, mencionabais ambas de la terminología es sin duda muy importante, y también el hecho de aprovechar la implementación del pacto y las reformas que va a llevar a cabo para establecer esta protección acentuada de los menores en situación migratoria. Totalmente de acuerdo.
Muchas gracias. A las dos tenemos una pregunta en el chat de Eva de UNICEF Islandia. Sería, para un Estado que no cuenta con centros de detención para migrantes, pero que está considerando implementarlos, ¿cuáles son, en su opinión, los argumentos más sólidos en contra y qué recomendaciones harían a la sociedad civil que trabaja en estos temas? Creo que aplica a las dos. O sea, si quieres responder tú, Valeria, o Carolina.
Would you like me to come in on that? Or sorry.
Of course. Yes. Yes. See.
Okay. So I think when it comes to the arguments, I mean, first of all, there is the obvious argument of children's welfare and the damage that immigration does to children. But from a state's point of view, it's also the damage that the immigration detention then does to a child's ability to live in their community. If the child is going to be leaving the detention center and living in the community, but is extremely damaged, then that damages society. And a lot of states are very concerned about the question of returns and sustainable reintegration of people returned to their countries of origin. If children have been damaged by detention, then the chances of sustainable reintegration are much reduced when thinking of arguments to discuss with governments. I think another point, as Carolina has talked about this important point of effectiveness, and governments are very concerned about people going missing. And I think it's an important argument that often children and families go missing because they're scared of detention. So it's a little bit circular, but there's this argument we need detention to stop people going missing, but people go missing because of detention. So I think that's important. And then we need to be creating our own evidence, our proper evidence, as Carolina has been talking about with the European Alternatives to Detention Network. It's really important that we now have evaluations of alternatives to detention that show very, very high levels of engagement with government systems. So, I mean, advice for civil society working on these issues, it's important to be able to be proving the case. We need to be, ideally, to be having more and more of these pilot projects that show about the alternatives to detention work, but taking those pilot projects and making them more than pilots, making those pilot projects, getting investment in those projects to make them go beyond being pilots to actually being the system. But I think for civil society working on these issues, obviously it depends on the country in which you are working. It's really, I think that IDC has shown that, and UNICEF as well, the importance of working with governments and proving to them the value of those partnerships between civil society and UN and government on provision of alternatives. And then lastly, this point about alternatives to detention, trying to show that when it comes to this tendency that there is in many governments now to say it's going to be simplest to just electronically have electronic surveillance, I think we really need to be engaging with governments on that topic, to be looking at the alternatives to the alternative digital technology. The only digital electronic surveillance is not the only digital technology available. Canada, for example, has shown that they use electronic surveillance in a very small number of cases of criminal cases, and the majority of people, they have people doing electronic check-ins, and there's a very great difference between checking in once a week or once a month to show that you're still engaged with the system than having somebody surveilling you 24/7. So there's a few points there. I hand over to the next person.
Yeah, I think Melanie has given very good arguments with regards to the point that we have been mentioning before about well-being and effectiveness, cost, and the issue of technology. One thing that I think is important to say, Eva, is that at IDC, for instance, we have more than 40 reports from different parts of the world, plus evaluations showing how alternatives to detention work. And I think this is going to be very helpful for civil society in terms of how they argue their case. And because your question goes more towards the civil society angle, one of the things, the way that European alternatives to detention started, and it started back in 2017, so it has been going on for quite a while right now, is because each country and in national context had their own civil society working on this issue and trying to look at the issue of detention. And for us, we kind of realize that if we're coming together and learning from what others are doing, we can produce a much stronger evidence base and also do peer learning as civil society on what works. And this is the way we have done it. And right now there is an impact report showing that from those exchanges, there actually have been quite a lot of things happening, like what Melanie was saying, government, civil society, partnerships, formal and informal arrangements, and some kind of breakthroughs, either with the national government or with the local authorities. So my specific advice, and as IDC, we are very happy and we offer ourselves to speak with whoever is from civil society that could benefit from this type of advice, because we will have a lot to say from other contexts and helping them to build an argument. If it's about the civil society side, if it's about the government side, same thing. I mean, UNICEF, IDC, many other organizations will be able to, these are ineffective policies. Ultimately, why would you spend money and time and all these resources just trying to design ineffective policies when if what you want to do is evidence-based policy making? If there is evidence-based policy making, this is not going to work. So again, some exchange with the policymakers and maybe sending some of the resources that they have been in Europe and in other parts. And again, very happy to have a more direct conversation so that we can think of engagement that could be useful to in terms of strengthening civil society on advocacy and persuading the government otherwise with this ineffective policy. Yeah.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Se ha hablado mucho del tema digital y quería preguntar, sobre todo, Carolina, tú hiciste mucha referencia a eso. ¿Existe algún tipo de alternativa digital que pueda resultar útil?
So, as I was mentioning before, right now we are completing research in different regions of the world with regards to the issue of digital technologies and alternatives to detention. I think the issue of technology is that it's advancing rapidly and is not properly tested, and there is a lot of disconnection in between those who are working on the technology, private companies, because the role of the private companies that benefit from this system is actually very big, and the role of those that are designing the policy on migration. And this is advancing in a pretty negative way from what we have been gathering in the research. For us, we have been trying to look at examples that could be positive about the digital technology. So if there was any way of doing reporting that wouldn't trace where the migrant is, which has been used in some contexts, that could be good. But the problem of what we're seeing is that the way the technology is working is that there is so much data being captured and there is so much involvement in the private sector that is working more on the negative way than the positive way. In terms of best practices, what we have been able to identify is that the involvement of those affected by these technologies is essential in terms of analyzing how these technologies will work. And that is not necessarily happening, but there could be systems where there could be some type of recognition, as long as there was not this full tracing, because the issue of the tracing is very complicated, and what we're seeing is that it actually doesn't work. So it's a complex topic, and we will be publishing this research very soon. But the idea is that technology works for people, not against people, and therefore, we need to be careful. And the other thing I would say with regards to how this area progresses is that Also from the civil society point of view, the organizations working on digital rights are not necessarily that well connected with the organizations working on migration. And it means it's almost similar to what is happening at the government level. And it means that the topic is advancing rapidly with very stigmatizing consequences. But of course, you cannot compare what it is, the effect of electronic tagging and monitoring with what could be telephone recognition or voice recognition on the phone. The issue with that is that the technology could also be faulty. And as you know, the issue of algorithms is one that we have to think, because that also has resulted in a number of cases where it was assumed the technology was working okay, and it's actually not, and it's actually stigmatizing people further. So yeah, of course, there are different technologies. Of course, we need to look for some that could work, but it's not that simple. But anyway, we look forward to publishing the research on this.
Muchas gracias. Y hablando de gobiernos, organización de sociedad civil y otros actores, ¿cómo podrían trabajar los tres para ofrecer soluciones comunitarias a los niños que se encuentran fuera de los centros de migrantes? ¿Sabéis alguna práctica buena o alguna recomendación que se ha hecho a gobiernos? No sé quién quiere empezar.
Pues yo creo que Carolina ha explicado muy bien un modelo que tienen efectivamente, que ha desarrollado IDC, que está específicamente pensado para los menores, ¿no? Y que consiste efectivamente en la gestión de casos, pero con unas características especiales que pretenden atender a sus necesidades específicas. ¿Puedo explicar?
Yeah, the child-sensitive CAP model, the community assessment and placement model, which is the one that I was explaining. But actually, the interesting thing to say with regards to examples is that this is being applied for some of the pilots of the European Alternatives to Detention Network. So some of the NGOs are using this model in the way that they are assessing the cases and through the different steps that I was mentioning before. And it's also being applied in other parts of the world. This has resulted into, as mentioned, into some interesting partnerships. I think, look, when we're dealing with an issue like detention and child immigration detention, and I think all the speakers said it, we will need to, it's essential that we look at models that are working together. We are not going to really make a dent on this issue if as sectors we're working separately. So we advocate very strongly for this connection in between government, civil society, UN agencies, and other relevant actors. And there are, say in Europe, a good example that I could think about right now is Belgium. In Belgium, the relationship between government and parts of civil society is very good, and they are working on, there is an Alternatives to Detention department. There is civil society like JRS in Belgium and others that are doing excellent case work models, and they are actually interacting between them and getting into a lot of traction that way. So that's an example that I can think of right now. But yes, a number of the pilots are applying this model that Valeria was referring to before. But this is just one example, but there are actually many.
Perfect, thank you so much. And unless anyone in the chat has any questions, I'll ask one last question. So it would be to get, how can we mobilize against detention and in favor of alternatives to detention? And what would be your recommendation, each coming from your own civil society organization, or Mel, the government UN organization? So Mel, do you want to start?
I couldn't hear that question well. Could you repeat it again, please?
How can we mobilize on alternatives to detention, and what would be your recommendation?
Thank you. So I think mobilizing, again, it's very different in different contexts, but I think we need on children. We're going into a time when there's going to be a lot of challenges on this topic. We know that migration is becoming a more and more politicized topic, and I think we need to humanize the debate. We're in a situation at the moment where even statistics and evidence don't really seem to be necessarily moving things. So we really need to hear from from people who can talk about the reality of what's happening in detention centres to children. So for those who are willing to talk about what the actual evidence of damage to children is, I think that's very important in mobilizing people to change the system. And I think that we're going through a time of great change in Europe, particularly. The whole system of asylum and migration is about to change. And whilst that brings a lot of threats, it also brings opportunities for engaging with governments. And so I think that this is every moment of great change can give an opportunity. So I think that it's a real call to civil society organizations to be engaging with governments about how they're going to implement the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, and to be offering alternatives to those governments, or support to governments providing alternatives. It's up to governments in the end how the system works, but civil society can persuade and can offer assistance and can push them in the right direction. And I think that this is going to be such an important moment for that. And what happens at the moment as well in one country can really affect what's going to happen in all the other countries in the EU and beyond. And so we need to set up models that other governments, we need to create a virtuous cycle here. We need to governments to be showing that if people have to wait near borders under the EU Pact for screening to take place or for processing of their cases to take place, that does not mean they need to be staying in detention centres or whatever they're going to call them. We need to be setting up models where people are able to live in communities and find ways of reassuring governments that it's possible for people to remain in communities while these processes are undertaken, and that in the end that is going to be a win-win situation. So I think it's a call for real focus on this topic in the next few months, because it's a moment of danger. Thank you very much.
So much, Mel. Do you want to go next, Aryan?
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra. I think in terms of mobilization on alternatives and specifically on ending child immigration detention, MYCP's view has always been it needs to be also coming from a grassroots effort. And I think young people in our consultations are saying time and time again, they don't understand the issue. It's very complex. It's very technical. There's law, there's advocacy, there's policy, there's all things kind of interacting together when it comes to detention. And that's what MYCP is trying to do. And our mobilizing efforts going forward need to focus on increasing public awareness, increasing what does detention mean? How does it happen? Why are young people being detained, and what legal provisions do they have to escape detention or to be free from detention, and how can we support them going forward? Those are the sorts of mobilization efforts we need, and that will ultimately turn into a wave of change that can influence policymakers. And that's been MYCP's approach, and we're proud to partner with UNICEF, IDC, Cepaim, and UNHCR in supporting those advocacy efforts to improve education amongst young people. And I think we have very key moments coming up in the migration governance space. MYCP is very proud to be co-chairing Roundtable 2 of the Global Forum for Migration and Development in Colombia later this year with Honduras and Brazil. And we will be using that opportunity to make sure that we can put ATD on the agenda, make it a clear statement that ending child immigration detention is a real priority, not just for young people, but for all stakeholders, whether it's a government, whether it's private sector, whether it's civil society, or whether it's academia. And going into IMRF 2026 in May next year, then that message rings loud and clear. So there is a political trajectory, there is a grassroots trajectory, and we hope that other stakeholders and partners will join us on our global trajectory of making sure that detention is a practice that is definitely the last resort, and that no child has ever had to face it ever again.
You, Aryan. Valeria, do you want to...
Sí, pues simplemente por cerrar también este apartado, yo creo que el caso de los migrantes hay que tratar de sacarlo de alguna manera de un ámbito tan contestado políticamente como el ámbito de las migraciones. Me parece que eso sería como algo absolutamente fundamental, de hablar más bien de derechos humanos y de protección de la infancia. Estoy diciendo algo muy evidente, pero es que no lo está siendo en la realidad y lo estamos viendo también, bueno, pues en España y en Europa y a nivel global. Yo diría que esa para mí es lo más importante y después, como han señalado ya, pues visibilizar esta realidad que no siempre es tan conocida, denunciar los efectos perniciosos de la detención de menores, trabajar en alianza a las organizaciones con conocimiento y con evidencias demostradas. La investigación es un punto importante. Bueno, pues trabajar también en alianza con los gobiernos y con otros grupos que puedan ser favorables a la supresión de la detención de menores migrantes.
Muchas gracias. Y por último, Carolina.
Yes, thanks, Alexandra. Just following on what Valeria has started, I mean, the issue is that migrant children are children first and foremost, and that's the main message, and as such, they have rights, right? So, I mean, this again and again, this is a message that we need to be saying, and then following on what Aryan and Melanie were saying before, this is, I mean, because this is such such a key human rights issue, and it's complex because it's political, and Melanie said it. I think we need to look at how to act, looking at different strategies and the value added that each actor has as part of this debate. So it needs to be joint work. And joint work how? So Aryan was mentioning before already about the role of mobilization, the role of youth leadership, action, etc. That is being done with regards to that. That's such an important role. Then there is the role of those that are close to those that are, I mean, there are champions also inside governments that are working on decisions that are against detention. We know a number of them. So working with those people and trying to advance this agenda. Then the role of organizations that are working very closely with decision makers. I mean, they're the role of the UN. I mean, this is not with what we at IDC do, etc. The role of people working in the country with regards to showing that the models actually work. So what I'm saying is that there is not one way of achieving this. There are multiple ways, and unless we see them as complementary rather than competing, and we understand that we are all part of this, that we need to play, all of us need to play on our value added, on how to change this dynamic. I mean, strategic litigation is another area. There are so many different ways of doing this, but we need to be kind of united and acting complementary rather than in agendas that don't combine with each other and play on our strengths, the strengths that each of us in this collective have to move this agenda forward and to show that, I mean, children are children first and foremost, and their rights need to be respected first and foremost, and this is not up to negotiation. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And with this, I'd say we're closing the event. Thank you to all the speakers in person and online. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.